So I want to welcome our guest today, Karl Bimshas, Bimshas Consulting. You can find out more about Karl at Bimshas, Bimshas consulting.com. We will make sure we put that in the show notes. So if as Karl talks today and you want to find out more or get in touch with him, you can go to bimshasconsulting.com. Karl, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here, Bill. Appreciate it.
I love talking with people who are in the leadership space because in a way, I think we're all leaders, whether we're a frontline salesperson or a director, manager, or VP. We're going to kind of focus our attention today probably more on those people who are in leadership positions. But I don't think there's anything you're going to say that doesn't apply to everybody, I suspect. So give us a little background on how you got into this business. You don't have to start from birth, but maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, how you arrived at this work and the kind of work you do. Give us a couple minutes on that.
Sure. Well, I'll have to go back further than that because I started at a Fortune 500 company, and that's where I got my management chops and all of that. That was at Xerox, and so there's a lot of good quality before a lot of trouble hit. So got a lot of good learning there. I also got my executive leadership master's degree at USD during that time, which helped me deal with some of managers and leaders that I did not like. So that was very helpful. As a result of that program, one of my cohort members hired me on as their director of sales development in their smaller firm. And so that was a great, I won't say introduction to sales because at Xerox, everybody does some sales and we certainly have stories involved with that. But I was definitely the operations guy and became head of sales guy at the smaller company and did that for almost 5 years. And 2008 came around, that last kind of recession time. Seems like a good time to start your own business. So that's what I did.
Yeah, good job.
So that's what I did and have been focused on all sorts of things inside the leadership realm, helping sales leaders, but also helping people with self-leadership, team leadership, organizational leadership. So you're right. It's leadership is leadership, and there's just some nuance depending upon, where you are or who you're leading.
So when you get called in either to a company or I know you work coaching senior level leaders as well, what are some of the challenges that you hear from them? And I'd also like to know, you can incorporate this or we can ask another question about how has that changed over the last weird 2 or 3 years that we've been in? What are some of the challenges they bring to you? And then we can dive into that other part.
Well, I'd say the simplest answer to that, it's always communication at the end of the day. It's almost always some version of communication. Either they're not understanding me and what I'm trying to be, get across, or upper management doesn't understand me, or, if they're an individual contributor, I'm can't get my ideas through. So it's almost always around some type of communication fundamentally.
Do they know that when they come to you, or do they
Almost never? No.
They give voice to other problems. You ferret that out and find.
Yeah. And I try not for it to be the hammer and the nail kind of thing. But it's inevitably a communication issue, and either, and then it gets into a personality part. It's either somebody who's like, hey, this is the way the world is, and why can't anybody see it the way that I see it? Or others are just, they're not as forceful with their communication or as assertive or something like that. So fundamentally, it's almost always communication. And that's been true since the dawn of time, I think.
Yeah. I find that in the sales work that I do is that we all fancy ourselves as really good communicators. And then when you hear people like, I say to people, how would you explain the value that you bring? How do you explain your uniqueness? They really struggle. It's not because they're bad people. It's because they've really never been instructed and taught exactly how to concisely communicate the value. And so I totally agree. It's a lot about that.
Yeah.
So that's, I would say communication is the external challenge. What are some of those things inside people? Because I believe that all problems start inside and then they work their way out. What are some of those inside matters that you think leaders struggle with a little bit?
Well, the ones that I deal with, it's almost always around confidence, the self-confidence, imposter syndrome, that type of thing. It can go the other side too. There's some that tend not to be my customers, but some are, where they're incredibly full of themselves and they, they're the leader or the one in charge, and why aren't people bending to their will kind of thing. So I would say, that sense of self-awareness, but also just the general confidence. It's somewhere confidence or competence. Usually,
Yeah.
sometimes it's a skill issue, but it's usually not a skill issue when it comes with me. It's more of like a behavior issue or a thought issue or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I heard Dan Harris, he did a podcast the other day, and he had an author of a book that had addressed imposter syndrome primarily in women, but then
Mhm.
she said, "Oh no, guys have the same issue."
Oh yeah,
And
yeah,
she had a spectrum, and she said on the one end is imposter syndrome, and on the other end is, I can't remember what she said. It was like irrational confidence. Like,
yeah,
you
yeah.
don't need to be as confident as you are because
Exactly right.
you're
Yeah,
not that good.
yeah, yeah. I completely agree with that.
Yeah. So when you start working with a company or a leader, what are the first couple of things that you bring to their attention? Is it more of an assessment, or once the assessment's done, what are the first few things that you really are mindful of starting with? Because I'm sure you have lots of different personalities, but I
Right.
suspect as a coach, you probably start most people in about the same place. What,
Yeah, I do a bit of an intake form that's fairly aggressive. Partly that keeps riffraff out because if people don't want to answer those questions, we're probably not going to get along.
yeah,
Um, but also, it's great coaching just in and of itself. They're almost doing some self reflection. And it's, hey, what are your goals? Where are you from your goals? Similar coaching stuff. If you didn't reach them, how would you feel? If you did reach them, how are you going to celebrate? So some fairly benign questions like that, but then have like a checklist of like, how are you sabotaging yourself? Or how are
do
you?
people know that? Do people know that generally, instinctively?
Um, so because this intake form is on their own, they tend to be a little bit more uh, giving of the information as opposed
Yeah,
to me like interviewing them because they're like, yeah, I kind of am. I do procrastinate, or I do, I'm too much of a control freak, or I'm not enough. I say yes to everything, So then I get that intake, and I have a pretty good feel for who they are, and so
mhm,
then our conversation is just testing that. Um, so that's where we start. But again, it's almost always, either. Well, then that's one of the questions is like, why do you want me? Is it because there's a problem going on that you're trying to fix, or you're looking to prepare for a promotion,
yeah.
and you're not used to leadership, or I get a good number of first time leaders as well, and they're like, ooh, I didn't think this was what it was going to be. Um,
Can I go
why I
back
like,
to what I was
uh,
in before?
yeah, and early level, early term directors are among my favorites. Say like 18 months into the role, because the honeymoon's over at that point, and that's when it's a little sad, but that's when it's fun for me. Because they're like the employees are starting to not do everything that they say. There's a little rebellion going on. The politics that they have to go through is starting to come up, and all that stuff that a lot of people hate. I kind of like because I'm not directly involved in it day to day.
Yeah, right.
So
You
so
live that life at Xerox, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So that scratches the itch for me though. So that's why I like
Yeah.
that kind of business as well.
Yeah, I had a gentleman by the name of Alan Allard on here. He's a coach, and one of the first questions he starts with, probably part of this intake that you do, is what do you want? And he said that is the hardest question for people to answer, especially if they're coming from a position of lack of confidence. Because if you're low on the self-awareness, self-esteem, self-confidence scale, it's hard to really imagine what you want being different than what you have. Do
Mhm.
you find that people are pretty clear by the time they get to this point, or do you have to coach them a little bit?
They're clear, but it's usually not the real thing. I have to do kind of a bait and switch, which is my issue that I kind of have to work on.
Yeah,
I'll ask the question, what does success look like for you? And if it's something that there's a time horizon, like if they're coming in and I know they just want to work for 3 months, that's different than somebody who wants to work for 6 months or a year or is uncertain. Um, but if I ask the question, let's say that they're they have high turnover or something like that. And like, well, what does success look like? We can probably predict what success looks like, but they might say something else is like, you know, I'm tired of recruiting, bringing in the wrong people or something like that. Now
yeah,
that's a different issue. So usually that's why I like this intake form that I use because it gets them thinking a little bit more so that our conversation, we're not wasting the time and I'm not
yeah.
sitting there trying to pull it out. And it's that fine line. You can't be doing psychotherapy on them or anything like that. So, but it's almost always not what they come in for.
Yeah, I think sometimes, and I agree with you about psychotherapy, but when I coach people, I always find that sometimes it's just the space that you give them to
Mm.
work on themselves and to reflect on some of these very difficult questions that they probably never haven't been asked in a while, if ever.
Right.
That's the difference makers, Carl and Bill and whoever else is coaching. They give me the space to kind of think through that and then challenge them or accordingly. And I just don't think people get enough of that in their day to day. If they don't have a coach, and it's not a pitch for coaching, although
Mm.
maybe it is. If they don't have a coach, there's even their spouse and their manager definitely, and the pastor and the psychotherapist. They really aren't bringing value by opening up that space.
That's right, and that's one of the things that I say, as I pitch accountability, is like, don't burden the people you love with accountability. you know, they have to
Never
put up with
works.
enough.
Never
They have to
works.
put up with enough stuff with you.
Yeah,
So don't expect your spouse to be your accountability partner, for work or some other stuff. It's like you
they'll
can't
do it.
be,
They'll
you
do
know,
it, but it won't be pleasant.
yeah, and it's just going to hurt you later. so,
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
We're talking to Karl Bimshas today. Karl is a leadership coach and advisor for companies and individuals. You can find out more about him at bimshasconsulting.com in the show notes if you BIMSHAS consulting.com. I want to pivot just a bit to the last 3 years, and I don't want to go into COVID and all that
mhm,
stuff. I'm more interested in the I don't know, the territory that we're in right now, where there's lots of layoffs either coming or have been. There's
mhm.
uncertainty in the marketplace given all the weirdness going on. How do you find that has affected leaders of teams? I was talking to a lady who just got laid off at Salesforce. Salesforce is big here in Indianapolis, and I was at Starbucks and I hadn't seen her. She's a young lady who's a friend of my daughter's, and she said, "Oh, it's really bad there. I mean, people they just laid off 10,000 and they laid off another 2,000, and whenever that happens, everybody's walking on eggshells." And
Right.
she
Mm.
said, "Half of my team is looking for another job." Well, how do you manage productivity on a team where everybody's kind of looking? So I think there's a lot of things that are happening. What kind of advice are you giving to leaders to how to navigate this?
So I usually go fairly controversial and adversarial, quite honestly, in that, because I think, if you're leading well, that kind of stuff isn't happening by and large. Like you've insulated your team, and so that, again, it depends on your level. If you're the owner of the company, you have different things than if it's your division and all that. But
Yeah,
as leader, you want to be protecting your team as much as possible, or if you're individual contributor, your clients as much as possible, right? So what are the things that you're doing there, and that's almost always connected to your own personal mission and purpose and values and those types of things. So I will always challenge people in the sense of like, well, what are your values, and are you sure you're acting congruent to your values?
hmm,
Because when people don't feel well and don't sleep well at night, it's because they're not acting congruent to their values, or what they think their
yeah,
values are supposed to be.
good
So
point.
that, for some people, can cut pretty deep, and it can be a showstopper sometimes, or embolden people to be like, okay, what else? Because if there are, a lot of layoffs going on, or a lot of other things that, is upsetting the company, those are symptoms in my world of poor leadership. I mean, if you're doing well, you're not laying people off. If you're valuing people, now business necessities and all that stuff, you got to do what you got to do. So what I've seen in the lately, I think more people are more open to that type of thinking, in the sense of, I'm let me word it this way. There's always going to be different types of people, right? So there's going to be very much hard charging capitalists. It's all, profit is what we're going to be measured by, and, they're going to be rewarded, and, that will exist. And then there's going to be others, depending upon your point of view, that are softer, or more gentle, and care about, the people and the
Yeah,
relationships and dignity and that type of thing. If you're going to be successful in business, you need both. You've got to have successful people. You've got to have successful results. So you can't go completely in one direction and it's all, profit first. And if you go all people first, that's great, but, at what expense?
hmm,
So,
hmm,
I'm going more. What I find with people is, people are, at least my audience, is more into yes, we got to have a little bit more humanity here. I mean, one of
Yeah.
my taglines is basically, I help you become a better leader without becoming a jerk. So
Yeah.
how can you do these things without being, uh, the a-hole? And it is possible, and most people want that,
Yeah.
for themselves. So,
Yeah.
um, you
But
know,
sometimes people need to know from you, exactly how to do that, because it's one thing to say that, and it's
right.
another thing they think, "Oh, no, I wasn't an a-hole, I just told them what I thought," and it was like, "Ugh," if it came across the way you just said, that probably didn't strike them very humanely.
Right,
So, I'm
right.
sure that's part of the effort that you do is, "Okay, you're gonna go talk to this person, let's role play it. How are you gonna say this?"
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why, and my stuff is very customizable, or I customize it a lot. So, leader X, I might give completely different advice to leader A, based on who they're leading, their circumstance, the industry they're in. It's different personalities, and I think we have to allow for that kind of nuance, in leadership. I mean, I am not a fan of authoritarian leadership at all. But if the building's on fire, we're going to follow the authoritarian leader who tells us what to do.
Yeah.
And so there's certain circumstances where we're going to go that way. So it's highly nuanced, which,
Yeah.
when I'm talking one-on-one with people, people get that. But then when you put them, and that's why I like the accountability part, where we'll say like, okay, what happened this week? And like, well, I said a few things like, was that was that
Okay,
the
let's
best
hear it.
thing to do? No, probably not.
Yeah.
You know, um, but I
Yeah.
honestly haven't seen changes per se in the last 2 or 3 years, other than Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
There are people have their different opinions. They love being away from the office. They're more productive. Others who are like, hey, it's a
Yeah.
little difficult. But again, my purview is not usually people who are having trouble. Um, well, they're having trouble, but like, it's not an issue of their own people not getting along. It's usually something with
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the whole Zoom thing or the virtual is a topic for another day. But,
Yeah.
last question here is, we've got a lot of listeners, and I think a lot of people I talked to a lot of people in my, coaching, and there seems to be a little bit of disgruntledness with the whole, and I think 2008 brought that on a little bit when there was, it was kind of a crazy recession, and then I think this has brought it on where people say, "Do I really wanna work for this company and sit and watch Zoom meetings 8 hours a day,
Right.
all to make my boss money and all
Mhm.
to make the people who own the company improve their bottom line so that they can sell it, get rich, and then I've got to." I mean, I know that I have a sense of what you'll say here, but I think there's this malaise a little bit in the worker category. And if you're leading people who you sniff that out,
Mhm.
how do you advise them to handle that? Because it's there, whether they're knowing or not. I mean, I know
Sure.
we'd all hope it's not there. It's there, and we know it.
Yeah. So most people want to contribute. Most people want to feel like they're valuable,
Yeah,
right? So kind of section out the people who it's just a job, I don't care, and it's just I got to make ends meet or whatever. This is more for people. It's like a vocation, or I've chosen this career, and so I'm working in this industry or something like that, as opposed to entry level folks who are just trying to figure it out
right,
still.
right.
Um, and I go back to sort of the three things. I mean, people either like to learn something, they like to enrich their relationships with the people that they're working with, or they like to be working on something bigger than themselves and do some
Mhm.
sort of legacy building. And I think the leader needs to appeal to all of those,
Yeah,
and tell the story, sell the story, of what they're doing. And so figure that out with your employees. If somebody who is really loves to learn, so teach them, show them the ropes, teach them
yeah,
some new things so that they stay active, involved. If they really like their people, all right, have them lead some teams or put together some, I hate to say put together committees, but get some partnerships going to
yeah,
solve some problems. And if it's legacy building, what are you trying to build? And
yeah,
do they want to be a part of that or not? And
yeah,
I think the leaders who can do that, then you've got a fairly engaged team, or as engaged as you can be right now, and also enough humility to say, hey, we're all in here, it's all stewardship, you're not here forever.
yeah,
And so encouraging people, uh, you should basically be interviewing every 18 months, regardless of your job, just so you know your value, right?
Hmm.
And so a leader should know that and be encouraging people too, if they want them to win. It's the same quote. I'm going to
Yeah.
misquote it, but what if somebody takes them, right? Well, what if we're stuck with them?
What if nobody takes us? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Very good. We're talking to Karl Bimshas. And Karl, I appreciate your time today. This has been really good. I hope you leaders have learned something. And if you want to get more information, go to bimshasconsulting.com. Again, in the show notes. I know I always say that. Karl, it's been really a pleasure. I appreciate you coming on. And maybe in 6 months from now, we can do this again and get deeper into some of these other topics that will raise their ugly head here in the next 6 months.
Sounds great. Appreciate it, Joe.
Thanks, Karl. Bye.
Take care.